When I say the word serial killer, the phrase serial killer, what comes to mind? Maybe someone like Ted Bundy, Jack the Ripper, or even Jeffrey Dahmer. The term serial killer was popularized by an FBI agent investigator in the behavioral science unit named Robert Ressler during the 1970s. What categorized someone as a serial murderer during this time was at least 4 deaths at separate locations, followed by cool-off periods in between each crime. In the 1990s, 3 murders could have the perpetrator be considered a serial killer. Still, in modern days, in this day and age, the definition has often been faulted due to many criminals being caught after 2 killings, stopping them from continuing on with their crimes. So they are not considered serial killers, but they most likely would have been after they killed a 3rd. There are a lot of criticisms on what categorizes a serial killer or what a serial murder is exactly. So the National Institute of Justice, which is a branch of the US Department of Justice, had to actually step in and come out with a concrete definition. By this official definition, a serial murderer involves at least 2 murders occupying at different times over a period of a few hours to a few decades. Criminologists have categorized different types of killers. There is the classic killer, often motivated by sexual gratification, the spree killer who is motivated by the thrill of it, and the quiet killer, ones who want to know how long they can get away with committing such crime. There are also the profit killers, only in it for money. Think of hitmen. But these aren't technically categorized as serial killers because they're doing the crimes for other people. FBI investigator Robert Ressler studied the most prolific killers during the 70s to create criteria for what is a serial killer. He interviewed Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer in person to know what drove them to kill. Using his background in the military and civilian law enforcement before he joined the FBI, Ressler wrote the rule book on serial murders. And then he gave this information to local police stations so they could learn what to look for when it comes to repeated murders. However, the term serial killer wasn't coined until the 1970s, and the first person to be categorized under the new term was actually Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer. Because they were interviewed for the criteria was based off of them. But Bundy was active during the years of 1974 to 1979, and Dahmer between the years of 1978 to 1991. So what about the serial killers before that? The term has only been coined for a bit more than 50 years. What about the serial murderers before then? We know they existed. Think of Jack the Ripper and Locusta the Imperial, the family poisoner. They are classified as serial killers in modern terms, but there wasn't a term to call them that back then. So what about the infamous Boston Strangler? A case from the 1960s in one of New England's most famous cities. A killer with 13 victims, all women. Someone confessed to the crime, and they technically went to jail for it. But modern DNA evidence has only proven that the person who went down for the crimes only killed one of them. So what if it actually wasn't a serial killer at all? Rather, a group of killers, maybe even a vast group of copycat killers. The murders span over the greater Boston area. But was the Boston Strangler truly a serial killer? Hey, I'm Serenity, and this is my channel, and today we're joined here by Nova, Pix, Scarlett's on the floor, Ginger's over there on the floor. And welcome to a new series on my channel, another true crime series. So as you can guess, I've decided to start this series called the Eastcoast Offenses, which is based on cases that happened on the Upper East Coast area of the United States. I've had this series in the works in here for months now for 2 main reasons. I have discussed in previous videos that my main true crime series on my channel, Hometown Horrors, based on cases in my hometown county of El Paso, Texas, I'm running out of cases. Point blank. It's one of the safest cities in America. There isn't many cases to go through. So I'm expanding that series to the greater Latinx community and Texas and New Mexico cases. But secondly, by creating this series, I've been attending the University of Massachusetts, Boston for over a year. I'm going to graduate from there next year, and in the new year, I'm actually moving up there to finish school. And I like to research cases based on areas I've been, kind of to get the lay of the land. So with me moving out to the East Coast, I thought it would be interesting to start a series based on the Upper East Coast area where a lot of government agencies are, which I think would be kind of interesting to see if there's any cases around that. And there are. Some will be coming later next month. So this is the new series, and I have a bunch of cases I can't wait to share with you. But before we begin with this case, I do want to give trigger warnings for murder, strangulation, mentions of sexual assault, mentions of break-in. If you believe any of these topics you'd be unable to handle, please stop watching, put yourself first, and I'll see you at a later date with a different video. If I get any information wrong, please kindly kindly let me know down below. This case is, I don't want to say old, but I was working off a lot of newspaper clippings from the time. So kindly let me know if I get the information anything wrong down below. I try to get the information as accurately as possible. As always, sources are linked down below for you. Lastly, this video is an informational research study that I'm sharing for academic entertainment reasons only. I mean absolutely no harm to anyone mentioned, especially the victim and the victim's family. Grab your throw blanket, grab some sort of snack, grab a drink, and let's get into the video. So the city of Boston is one of the first cities made by American settlers, and today we are traveling back to the 1960s. On June 14th, 1962, a 55-year-old woman named Anna Seltzers was found unalive on the kitchen floor of her Gainsborough Street apartment. Her cause of death seemingly was strangulation because the belt to her bathrobe was tied around her throat. The death horrified the town, but there was not a lot of time for them to actually grieve, as in the next few weeks, 3 more women would be found unalive in their apartment. 12 days later, on June 28th, 1962, 85-year-old Mary Mullen was found strangled to death in her own apartment on Commonwealth Avenue. Things got even odder though, because just 2 days later, on June 30th, 1962, 68-year-old Nina Noma Nicholas was found strangled to death in her apartment, also on the street Commonwealth Avenue. In fact, just a mile and a half away from Mary Mullivan's apartment. But that's not all. That very same day, the 30th, 65-year-old Helen Elizabeth Blake was found strangled to death in her own apartment on Newell Street, all the way in Lynn, Massachusetts, a 30-mile distance from Nina's apartment. Basically, that's no longer Boston. That's the greater Boston area. That 2 deaths in one day, and they were pretty far apart. Police began noticing some sort of pattern. These 4 victims were all brutalized, sexually assaulted, and then they were strangled to death. They were all older, senior citizen aged, unmarried women living in their own apartments, which were relatively kind of the same distance from each other. While investigators tried to figure out if these 4 murders were connected and committed by the same person, July remained quiet while police were investigating. But by August, the killer was back at it. On August 19, 1962, Edith Ida Ergus was found in the same manner of the 4 previous women in her Grove Street apartment. Just 2 days later, on August 21st, 1962, 67-year-old Jane Sullivan was found strangled to death in her Columbia Road apartment, this time in Dorchester, which is 6.5 miles away from Ida's home. That was 2 more victims in the span of just 2 days, and now the killer's victim count was up to 6. All senior citizens living alone, unmarried, in their own apartments. Between the months of June and August, local news began to cover the story. The local newspaper called the Record American brought in a sketch artist named Sam Nazzaro to create a sketch of what had been coined the Phantom Strangler or the Boston Strangler. In late August of 1962, Record American printed the paper with the sketch. The greater area of Boston was engraved in terror as local newspapers continued to cover the killings in great detail. As, and I quote, "maniacal spree of violence that has gripped in the terror thousands of greater Boston women who live alone." Now keep in mind, this was during a period of time when local news would quote-unquote help in investigations of a crime. Now, they did help in a lot of investigations all across the world, but in this case, that is very much questionable. We're going to go into it later. So they would print sketch artist pictures of perpetrators, interview detectives on the details of active cases, and then go print those details in the paper. And they actually would kind of investigate themselves, interview witnesses, local people in the area, that sort of thing. It was a very different time in journalism than we kind of see today. Today, we learn about murders after they commit the crime and have gotten caught. The general public today doesn't actually know if there is an active serial killer on the loose, or if we do know, usually they are quite a few victims in by the time they're coined that. In fact, according to the Scientific American, actively there are 25 to 50 serial killers active at any given point, meaning there's that many right now active that we don't know about. And right now there actually seems to be a believed serial killer active in Austin, Texas, but the police are not acknowledging it. However, it is so much easier to get caught nowadays with alert systems like Ring doorbells, instant news notifications like Amber Alerts and that sort of thing, red alerts, along with modern DNA. So that is another main factor as to why serial killers are less seen in the 21st century. It's a lot easier when everyone has a 4K camera in their phone to be caught. Through the reports in the paper, many people learned that the victims had been attacked in their own homes after seemingly willingly letting the killer inside their residence. Many people became unnerved by this fact, and many women in the Boston area started carrying pepper spray, ammonia spray, and tear gas guns on their person, along with locking their doors at night or anytime they were in the apartment. Now, again, this was a different time. You just wouldn't lock your door. No one thought anyone would come in who was unwelcomed. You just wouldn't lock your door. So police made a public service announcement for any woman who may live alone to start locking their doors along with their windows at all times. Again, this was not common during the period. Police also advised women to never, ever, ever allow anyone into their apartment until they are absolutely certain of their identity. Between the months of September, October, and November of 1962, no new killings were reported until December of 1962, when the killer's cool-off period seemingly ended. The next few killings both aided and harmed the investigation. You see, it helped break the case open to a wider range. The police department at different units began to work together, something that wasn't common. So let's say the unit in Beacon Hill started working with the unit in South End, which are pretty far apart from each other. They started to share any tips they got with each other. Up until this point, each borough was working separately, and this was not a usual practice. However, the next few killings would harm the progress that police made in the case, because up until this point, police had thought they knew what the MO of the killer was, who he liked to target, and that was senior citizens, unmarried women living alone in their own apartments. That was the MO, and they were all white women. But this all changed on December 5th, 1962, when 20-year-old Sophie L. Clark, an African-American student studying at Carnegie Institute of Medical Technology, was found strangled to death with a pair of her own stockings in the foyer of her Huntington Avenue apartment. Police quickly realized that the profile they had created for the killer was not true anymore, and it was scrapped. No longer were the victims older white women living alone, but now women of any age and any race living alone. Whoever was committing these crimes, whether it was an individual or a group of men, was starting to get hazardous with their attacks, because Sophie was the first person they would find with semen left on her body. And by the end of the month, the killer would strike again. On December 31st, 1962, 23-year-old Patricia Jane Bissett was found unalive in her Park Drive apartment, only a mile and a half away from Sophie's apartment. Patricia was found with a white blouse and 3 different pairs of stockings tied around her neck. By the end of 1962, a total of 8 Bostonian women had been killed in their own homes. The city was terrified. Now, I want to jump back to the summer of 1962. A reporter at the Record American named Loretta McLaughlin asked her editor to give her permission to look into the unsolved murders plaguing the city, after seeing a pattern between Anna, Mary, Nina, and Helen's death. Loretta's first piece was a hit. Now, this was during a time where women were only given the household stuff, so testing this new product, the new toaster, the new oven, that sort of thing. The beauty tips, the homemaker tips, the parenting tips. That was what the women were allowed to write. There was a few women who could write anything really they wanted. They had their specialties, whether that was medicine, whether that was investigation, sports, that sort of thing. But it was common that in all newspapers and news stations, women were given those sort of things. So Loretta's first piece was a hit with the general public. She had already earned positive feedback on her medical stories in the past, that her editor paired her with another well-known journalist at the Record American named Jean Cole, known for her multiple-year-long expose on the Massachusetts nursing homes and the abuse she found there. By January of 1963, the pair began working together to write an investigative series on the strangling killings. They are, in a way, credited for the Boston Strangler name. They called him the Phantom Killer, and then they said, no, that's not catchy enough, so they changed it to the Boston Strangler. And that is the name that has stuck. Together, the pair would reconstruct the crime scenes and dissect the police investigation to see if they were able to solve the case and keep the general public informed. These publications infuriated local police investigators, because such extensive detail of the crime scene had been printed for the general public to read, and they feared anyone reading could confess to the crime for infamy or become a copycat killer based on the information that was being presented to them. Something that is going to come up later on. And I mean, these papers, they were so detailed. Things that you will not read about today in any case unless you pay for the court documents. This fear was backed up by an article published on January 23rd, 1963, which in detail listed the names, ages, employers, hobbies, times of death, causes of death, where the bodies were found in the apartment, what they were wearing, the address of the apartments, and if they were sexually assaulted, along with if the apartments had been robbed at all, for all 8 victims at this point in an active investigation. Information that we do not know on modern cases today. So this was a lot of details the women were sharing to the general public. But it was so much detail that it was even questionable why they were sharing it when the killer or killers were still on the loose. In an article titled Stranger Strong, Calm Cold Killer, the writing duo penned that their working theory, the murders, were all done by one person, someone who is intelligent, a sort of psychopath who has a history of deviant sexual behavior. This is who they classified as the killer. And they even linked possible connection between all 8 attacks. Loretta and Jean noticed that each of the victims presented themselves and with these factors of their character, and I quote, orderly, well-groomed, self-sufficient, respectable. These were women who seemingly had their lives together in order. They were very independent, they lived on their own, they didn't need a man, and they held themselves to high standards. Someone who, from there, a deviant psychopath with a love for assault, would want to tear that sort of woman down, that strong woman down. Other details Jean and Loretta noted about each crime scene was that the murders were all committed using a personal item of clothing of the victims that the victims had in their home or were wearing, and it was often their own pantyhose, wrapped in a bow around her neck like a present, strangling her to death. The killer would then linger around the victim's apartment, looking at their belongings, and these sexual assaults were never completed, if you understand what I mean by that. A certain thing on his part was never there, except in the case of Sophie, and another victim we will discuss later. In the 31 days of January of 1963, Loretta McLaughlin and Jean Cole had co-published 29 articles, but by February of 1963, their reporting had come to a screeching halt. Political pressure, other newspapers, critics, medical examiners, and police officers believed that the women's editorials were causing more harm by meddling in the case that was ongoing. The next string of murders would continue to confuse the investigators, leaving even more doubt in the general public's mind about when the string of terror would end and when the killers would be caught. On March 6, 1963, 69-year-old Mary Ann Brown was found stabbed multiple times and strangled to death in her Park Street apartment, all the way up in Lawrence, Massachusetts. The killer seemingly had a cool-off period because the next murder came on May 6, 1963, exactly 2 months later, when 23-year-old Beverly Florence Salmon was found in her University Road apartment located in Cambridge, Massachusetts, over 30 miles away from Mary Ann's home. Beverly had been stabbed to death, but was found with a pair of stockings and scarves tied around her neck. This was the first victim to be found stabbed. No longer was the killer in the general Boston area, but now he was killing in Cambridge and Lawrence, along with Lynn, one of the first other locations out of the Boston general area. And he was also now stabbing his victims to death, something that didn't happen with the previous victims. 4 months later, on September 8th, 1963, 57-year-old Mary Evelyn Corbin was found dead in her Lafayette Street apartment located in Salem, Massachusetts. Just 2 months later, on November 23rd, 1963, 23-year-old Joanne Graff was found unalive in her Essex Street apartment in Lawrence, another murder in Lawrence. The final killings would happen on January 4th, 1964, when 19-year-old Mary Ann Sullivan was found dead in her Charles Street apartment in Boston. The killer had traveled so far with the last killings from Mary Ann Brown's home in Lawrence, Mary Ann Sullivan's home in Boston. The killer had traveled over 34 miles. This was all before August 3rd, 1964, when the MBTA, the Boston, Massachusetts train system, subway system, whatever you want to call it, was officially opened. So there was a limited chance that the killer was taking public transport. Even today, the single trip between Lawrence and Boston would take 2 hours and 19 minutes. That's not saying that the killer couldn't have a car, but even then, the drive between these two locations would take 40 minutes. The public became very fed up, and at this point, Edward Brooke, the Massachusetts Attorney General, knew it was time to take full control of the investigation, just days after Mary Ann Sullivan's death. He immediately created a task task force that would be nicknamed the Strangler Bureau. He promised the general public that he would be completing a centralized investigation based out of multiple different municipalities, dedicating a plethora of new resources in order to catch the killer. It wouldn't be until October 27th, 1964, 9 months later, that a huge break in the case would happen. A man named Albert DelSalvo conned his way into a unsuspecting woman's apartment, posing as a police detective. You see, the working theory up until this point of how the killer was getting into these women's apartment was that he was posing as someone with authority. May that be a police officer, landlord, or handyman, someone you would let into your apartment, because there was no signs of forced entry into any of the 13 different apartments. This woman's apartment that DelSalvo entered was sexually assaulted in her own home, and in an odd break of the normal pattern, he apologized to the woman before leaving. The woman immediately reported her assault to police, and they found DelSalvo based on a description she gave him. His picture would then be printed into the newspaper in the tri-state area, reporting on the crime that he was arrested for, and this prompted a multitude of other women to come forward with their own personal stories of DelSalvo attacking them too. Albert DelSalvo would then be charged with assault, burglary, and sexual offenses, but not murder. Albert DelSalvo was not new to crime though. He was known for sexually explicit crimes. You see, Albert wasn't picked up for the Boston Strangler murders, but rather a whole different case. The arrest from that woman's apartment he broke into on October 27th was a whole different string of crimes he was committing. A case known as the Green Man in Connecticut, the state that sits just below Massachusetts. But before the Green Man, there was the Measuring Man. So, let me explain both of these cases. In 1961, the Measuring Man would knock on the apartment doors of pretty single women in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And these women were single. He would claim to be some sort of scout of the well-known black and white modeling agency. He then would compliment the young woman on her looks, how she would be the perfect fit for their new talent they were looking for, and asked if he could come into her home to take her body measurements, hence the nickname, the Measuring Man. That was a whole sham. He would use taking these women's measurements, her waist, her bust, her leg, her bum, all that, and would use the opportunity to grope them while doing so. Some of the women he measured said he was fishy because there was actually never any follow-up on them being added as new talent to the agency. Then in March of 1961, the Cambridge police arrested a man because he was attempting to break into a house. This man was Albert DelSalvo, and he confessed to police to being the Measuring Man, something they didn't ask him, he just kind of confessed to it, and he would serve a year in prison. Then in 1964, the Green Man had a very similar MO to the Measuring Man. He would talk his way into apartments claiming he was sent by the building as a repairman to fix something, or he was a delivery man, a mailman dropping off a package, or he would just break it. In the Green Man cases, he would just break it sometimes. He was often seen in green clothes resembling those of workmen's wear, so green bottoms, utility pants. Hence the nickname the Green Man. The woman's sketch from the case he was arrested for in 1964 looked a little too much like the Measuring Man from his known mannerisms along with his clothing. So police, using the new information, located Albert based literally off of him, his appearance from a crime he has committed before. So police arrested Albert DelSalvo, the convicted Measuring Man, on suspicions that he was now the Green Man, in his home in Malden, Massachusetts. Albert claimed to have sexually assaulted more than 300 women across 4 different states, including Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. But investigators claimed that DelSalvo was the kind of criminal to inflate his crime numbers so he would become more infamous. It was while he was awaiting trial for the Green Man crimes in late 1965, while being held in a prison for the criminally insane called Bridgewater State Hospital, Albert told his fellow inmate George Nasser that he was also the Boston Strangler. Nasser then contacted his lawyer F. Lee Bailey about what his fellow inmate DelSalvo told him, and they met with the man in prison. So Bailey taped his interview with DelSalvo unknowingly without Albert's lawyer, who was his lawyer for this case, present. Bailey then took a controversial step to get information on the stranglings from the Boston police. That way he could test if DelSalvo actually knew about the crimes. What he was saying to Bailey, if that was true, according to what police have on the case. Bailey then played the recordings of the conversation he had with Del Salvo for the police, where he gave specific details on some of the murders, including the furniture colors in certain apartments and the identity of one of the 13 victims. That was never published into the papers at this point. Albert DeSalvo's confession to being the Boston Strangler led to Bostonians finally believing that the Strangler had been caught. However, there was no physical evidence to actually link Del Salvo to any of the crimes. We will come back to this point later on. In January of 1967, Albert Del Salvo would go to trial for the Green Man assaults, and Gene Cole, the Record American reporter, would lead the team to report on the trial. F. Lee Bailey, George Nassar's lawyer, would represent Del Salvo and would actually later defend O.J. Simpson. Now, F. Lee Bailey had a really strange defense angle in this case. He actually would argue that his client was the Boston Strangler, and he should be sentenced for the Green Man crimes to a mental hospital, and, I quote, where doctors could try to find out what made him kill, rather than going to prison. Del Salvo was none the wiser and just went along with what his lawyer was saying. But even though Del Salvo would have probably been sentenced to 25 years in prison for the Green Man crimes, he probably would have been released on 10 years on good behavior. He still went along with F. Lee Bailey's defense. However, during this trial, when Del Salvo was being tried for the crimes of the Green Man, not the Boston Strangler crimes, the jury didn't know that Del Salvo had admitted to being the Strangler. They didn't know this at this point. But Bailey brought that up in this case to say my client should be going to a mental hospital instead of to prison. This was not on their radar. So really, what he said was my client, basically in layman terms, is on trial for entering people's homes. What the jury was hearing, information they didn't know, but what they were hearing is the case that they are being the jury for, where the defendant would break into women's homes, assault them, maybe take a couple of their items. That man was also responsible for murdering women with the same MO. 13 women, something that had been plaguing the city for so long. Why Bailey brought this up? We may never know. His client could have gotten 25 years, then been out, then been tried for the Strangler case. So the jury punished Del Salvo a lot harsher, knowing that he now had the capabilities to murder people, not just break into their homes and essay them. They basically charged him as the Strangler without sending the Strangler case, because they know if this man were to get out in 10 years, he can continue his Boston Strangler ways. So, Del Salvo was sentenced to life in prison, and F. Lee Bailey was appalled during final statements claiming, and I quote, "Society is deprived of a study that might help deter other mass killers who live among us, waiting for the trigger to go off inside them." Basically stating by sending him to life in prison and not to a mental hospital that they can't use his testimonies to prevent other serial killers and finding out what makes people do that. But because Del Salvo was sentenced to life in prison for the Green Man assaults, he was never tried for the Boston Strangler murders. Everyone just accepted that he was the presumed killer because he confessed and he's already spending life in prison. In February of 1967, shortly after being sentenced to life in prison, Albert DeSalvo actually escaped from Bridgewater State Hospital with 2 of his fellow prisoners. It didn't take long for guards to figure out that DeSalvo was gone, especially since there was a note left on his bed addressed to the hospital superintendent. The note claimed he had to escape because the conditions in the hospital were so foul. A full-scale manhunt was launched to find Del Salvo, who was hiding just in the general public, dressed as a U.S. Navy Petty Officer 3rd Class, but he turned himself in just a couple days later. Albert Del Salvo was then moved into a maximum security prison named Walpole State Prison. And then 6 years later, after the transfer to this new prison, in November of 1973, Albert Del Salvo was found stabbed to death in the prison's infirmary right before he planned to recant his confessions to being the Boston Strangler. His killers have never been identified. It obviously was someone who was an inmate in the prison. The question of who did it was never solved. There is a large debate as to if Del Salvo was actually the Strangler, and we're going to talk about it. But first, on July 11, 2013, the Boston PD believed they had finally located some concrete evidence connecting Albert Del Salvo to the murder of his last victim, Mary Ann Sullivan. Salvo's nephew had given his DNA over to police, and according to DNA analysis, Albert Del Salvo was a near identical match to the DNA collected from Mary's body and a blanket in her apartment. Upon this discovery, the Massachusetts courts ordered for DelSalvo's body to be exhumed, where DNA samples were collected from his femur and teeth before he was buried again. Using these DNA samples from DelSalvo directly, on July 19, 2013, police were able to determine that Albert was for certain the man who SA'd and ended Mary Sullivan's life. Her case had officially been closed with DNA evidence, but the case for the other 12 Boston Strangler victims remained unsolved in the general public's mind. DNA evidence was found only to link Albert DelSalvo to one of the murders, which led way to the theory pestering Bostonian for decades. What if there actually was multiple killers throughout the years of terror? In 1995, a book written by Suzanne Kelly titled The Boston Stranglers was released, where she detailed many details never shared with the public before, where multiple police, prison officials, psychiatrists, and fellow prisoners who knew Albert DelSalvo personally did not believe that he was the Boston Strangler. The main argument for many of these people was that if a true serial killer was the one to commit this horrendous crime, the only uniformity was that the women who lived alone were strangled to death. Those were the only things that connected all of them. They were all women who lived alone and were strangled to death. There was no single age group, ethnic group, neighborhood, nothing. No for killing after the assault, no general area of the attacks. It wasn't that the Beacon Hill neighborhood was the one where the attacks were happening. This was happening in all over the tri-state area, even leaving Boston for a couple of the murders. In 1968, Dr. Amos Grauby, the medical director at Bridgewater State Hospital, where DelSalvo was being held until his attempted escape, claimed he knew that there was no way that Albert DelSalvo could be the strangler. On the former patient, he said, and I quote, "A very clever, very smooth, compulsive confessor who desperately needed to be recognized." The Middlesex District Attorney John Jay and the Superintendent of Bridgewater, who DelSalvo had written that note to, Charles Gahan, also shared the theory that Dr. Amos Robbery held about DelSalvo. A former inmate of DelSalvo named George W. Harrison claims that he heard another inmate at Bridgewater coaching DelSalvo about intimate details regarding the murders, setting him up to take the fall, coaching the inmate. John E. Douglas, a former FBI agent and criminal profiler, doubted that DelSalvo could be the infamous Boston Strangler. In fact, his book, The Cases That Haunt Us, he profiled DelSalvo as a power assurance, motivated rapist, someone who gets off on the power of assaulting someone. But this criminal is unlikely to kill. He would rather take credit for the crimes they didn't commit, in hopes of infamy. F. Lee Bailey, DelSalvo's attorney during the Green Man trials, wholeheartedly believed that his client Albert DelSalvo was the killer, and even wrote about the case in his memoir titled The Defense Never Rests, released in 1971. Now let's get into F. Lee Bailey. He had gained celebrity status from other defense cases he was head lawyer in. His memoir would become a bestseller, and he even briefly had a television talk show. For decades, there was rumors that F. Lee Bailey was corrupt, and the Massachusetts bar investigated him for unethical handling in Albert DelSalvo's Green Man case, where he was almost disbarred. DelSalvo would also dismiss Bailey from being his lawyer and hire another lawyer to pursue claims that Bailey had negotiated book deals and movie rights to his client's story, pocketing the money that would go towards DelSalvo's estate. There were even rumors that F. Lee Bailey purposely got DelSalvo convicted to life in prison during the Green Man trial, knowing that DelSalvo wasn't going to keep him as his attorney during the Boston Strangler trial. That way, Bailey's name would always be tied to the Boston Strangler case, pushing him towards celebrity status. And let's not forget, this is the same man who defended O.J. Simpson, and we all know O.J. Simpson committed the crime. So let's go back to Susan Kelly's book. She drew from multiple different case files that she got access from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Strangler Bureau, the team that was tasked to solve the case. Suzanne argued that there were multiple killers, rather than just one. In fact, she believed that there were 8 or 9 different killers at most. The reason that DelSalvo even confessed was the hopes that all the press around him would make money for his wife and kids to live on once he was in jail. Albert DelSalvo had this obsessive need for constant attention, good or bad, and he just wanted eyes on him. Suzanne Kelly also theorized that F. Lee Bailey, whose original client was George Nasser, who introduced him to Albert DelSalvo, had this ironclad control over DelSalvo for years while they were in the mental hospital. This is the man that George W. Harrison is believed to have seen with Albert DelSalvo, coaching him on confessing to the killings. In fact, the theory is that George Nasser actually committed one or more of the killings himself, which would show how Albert knew certain details on crime scenes he seemingly was never at. The theory is that George Nassar brought on his lawyer, F. Lee Bailey, to get Albert DelSalvo's coached confession unlawfully, and then pair George and F. Lee together, would take deals on the movie rights, the book rights, that sort of thing, and they would each get a large cut of that money that they knew was going to come. Keep in mind, this is before Son of Sam laws were in effect that prevented a perpetrator from making money off of their crimes. Former FBI profiler Robert Ressler, who we spoke about at the very beginning, backed up some of Susan Kelly's claims, saying, and I quote, "You're putting together so many different patterns regarding the Boston Stranglers murders that it's inconceivable behaviorally that all of these could fit just one individual." Now, to this day, there is no physical evidence besides the DNA found on Mary Sullivan to tie Albert DelSalvo to any of the other 12 Boston Strangler murders. There have been multiple witnesses who had seen suspicious men hanging around near the crimes, but never were they able to positively identify the man as a suspect to police. Susan Kelly also believes that it is possible for DelSalvo to have been fed some sort of corroborative details, not only from Nassar, but also from Detective John Bottomley himself, who was credited as cracking the case and would later go on to become a paid consultant on the film based on this case in the late 1990s, I believe. Bottomley would make money off of being the hotshot detective to crack the case, even though we don't even know if that's true, that he was the one to do it. One of the veteran homicide detectives at the BPD claims they never found, personally, Albert DelSalvo convincing as the Boston Strangler, especially after interviewing some of his Green Man victims, who oddly described the sex fiend as a knife-wielding serial rapist with a surprisingly gentle, concerned, and well-mannered behavior aura around him during the attacks. In the year 2000, the former print journalist and attorney Elaine Sharp looked into the connection between the DelSalvo family and Mary Sullivan's family, the final publicized victim. Even though Mary was believed to be the last victim in 1964, multiple other murders still occurred after his conviction with the same manner of death, strangulation. Elaine helped assist both of the families to clear DelSalvo's name, organized the exhumations of both Mary and Albert's bodies, filed a multitude of lawsuits trying to obtain information on the trace evidence found in Mary's apartment, and even worked with several producers to create documentaries to explain the true facts in the Strangler case to the general public. Some of the biggest evidence that Elaine Sharp noted pointed to DelSalvo not being guilty was his confessions to the crime, and the crime scene information being different. Unlike Albert's confession to Mary's murder, she wasn't found with male fluid in her genitals and not strangled to death using one's hands, but rather some sort of ligature. Michael Baden, a forensic pathologist, even noted that the times of death that DelSalvo gave for the victims were wrong, something Suzanne Kelly pointed out in her book. It is odd, though, that out of the 13 victims, the one family that is trying to get the presumed killer let off is the only one where DNA evidence can be linked to. What about the DNA evidence found on Sophie Clark? Finally, let's get into Jean Cole and Loretta McLaughlin, the two record American journalists who chronicled the murders. Many people believed that the women's work was not for the best of the public interest. Mary Sullivan's nephew told the local news, and I quote, "They helped to create and feed the narrative that there was a sole serial killer stalking the women of Boston from 1962 to 1964. By doing so, they did a disservice to investigators working for the Boston Strangler Task Force, which identified at least 6 suspects who they believed had committed the murders independently from each other. 6 different killers." Even decades later, after the murders were presumed to be over, Loretta McLaughlin addressed the burning question that she constantly got, writing, and I quote, "People still ask if Albert DelSalvo was really the Boston Strangler. Yes." Suzanne Kelly still defended the women's reporting to some extent in her book, discussing how the pair's reporting was brilliant, investigative journalism, and the two extraordinarily resourceful and tenacious reporters. However, she did stop her praises there, stating, and I quote, "The template for homicide provided by the Record American's Strangler worksheet no doubt influenced other criminals as well." After the Boston Strangler reports, Jean Cole continued to work in crime investigation journalism and retired from the Record American's successor publication, the Boston Herald American, and would retire from there in 1981, later passing away from old age in 2015 2018 at 89. Loretta McLaughlin would change to health and medicine investigative journalism, known for her early coverage of the AIDS crisis, and later passed away in 2018 at the age of 90. And that is all the information I have on this case. So let's discuss it. This is one of the cases that, going into it, I was like, oh, there's a convicted killer. Then I actually watched the movie, like reenactment on it, on Hulu that came out last year. And before doing the research, I wanted to see if that give me any sort of perspective. That movie is in the point of view of Jean Cole and Loretta McLaughlin, and it has someone who has recently visited Boston and greater areas where this took place. I don't know if I believe it was just Albert DelSalvo. To me personally, it feels more likely that maybe there was a group of copycat killers or a syndicate of killers who were grouped together. I honestly don't know. Hopefully this case will get concrete evidence eventually that either links them all to DelSalvo, but I did not go into that there was two other cases, one in New York and one in Michigan, that had the same MO and same exact style of killing as the Boston Strangler. And one of those, the one in Michigan, seemed to be the boyfriend of one of the victims. He was the head suspect. He moved out of Boston to Michigan or Minnesota, one of the two, and committed a crime. He was the main suspect in that case. I think during a time where you could get away with a lot more, maybe it was a group of copycat killers, especially when the basically blueprint is laid out to you in your morning newspaper. That's not to take away from Loretta and Jean's reporting, it's just to say I don't know if that much information should have been published. But yeah, let me know your thoughts and opinions on this case down below. Do you think it was a group of copycat killers? Do you think it was Albert DelSalvo? Let me know. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on post notifications if you want, My socials are all linked down below if you want to follow me. And as always, as a palette cleanser, we have this picture of Ginger. She's been sleeping over there the whole time. And that's all I have for you. Love you, minute kisses. Don't do anything stupid, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!